This is Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.
Good morning. I'm glad you're tuned in this morning to another iteration of Cogitations, and I hope that your Sunday morning is off to a great start. There's no better way, I think, to start any day than with some meditation upon spiritual matters, and that's what we hope to do over the course of the programming today and the many weeks ahead of us. Our particular topic that we're getting into, as was discussed last Sunday morning, is faith. We're going to look at faith, hope, and love over the next several weeks, starting with faith. That's the order that we're given it in 1 Corinthians 13:13, that these three remain, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And so we're going to start with faith. I frame it in a sort of different word. I call it Faithletics. I actually use that for a title of a book on this topic. Faithletics, because our faith isn't something that just sits on the shelf and we look at. It's not a noun, but it's a verb, it's an adjective, it's out there, it's moving, it's active. And so that's what our faith needs to be, and that's why I use that term faithletics, because it kind of gives us that ideal, just like athletics, that it's in motion, that it's moving. And we're going to capture that as we look at this topic and as we examine it. Now, the landscape of our world is populated with a host of diverse cultures hosting numerous and various religious organizations, bolstering a vast array of beliefs and doctrines. Now, while each one stands independent, holding its own unique fragment of religious mantle of our world, they are simultaneously connected by one keystone concept, which they each depend on for each associated practitioner to thrive. This common keystone is faith, a seemingly simple word which people throughout the world use every day. Yet the very concept which is implied in the religious word can become quite complex. While I have a working knowledge of many of the religions of the world, I'm not going to focus my efforts on any of the particular religions except Christianity, and thus will be utilizing references from the Bible, of course. However, even if you are not a Christian or of the Christian persuasion, I believe you will still find great value in what we're going to talk about when it comes to faith and the general theme of faith as it is related in the Scriptures. So let's explore what faith is all about and the complexity of faith. Now, the first question that I will briefly explore is the one that entered your mind as soon as you saw or heard the title of this book, Faithletics. What is it? And I gave you a brief explanation of it, but let us begin with the obvious. It is a blend of two words, faith and athletics. According to dictionary.com, athletics is defined as the practice of athletic exercises and principles of athletic training. Thus, in the application, it is a practice by which one exercises their faith, or the principles utilized in the training of an individual's faith. The fundamental principle that stands behind the word being blended with the word faith is the simple reality that the only way to improve in most aspects of our lives is through the serious application of meaningful practice and training. No one can honestly expect that they will improve any part of their being without putting forth the needed effort to do so. Nor can anyone truly expect to maintain healthy growth in that area without the consistency in that practice and training. Letics was the straightforward and easiest portion of the blend to define. Faith has become more complicated with the passing of time and the ever-broadening application of the word beyond what it meant when it was penned in the Scriptures. but I am confident that we can return to its roots in short order and recapture the heart of the word faith. When simply considering the English language, the last two definitions offered by dictionary.com best capture the essence of what is generally being expressed by its use in the biblical text. While the rest holds certain truth with regards to their application to the various religious organizations of the world, they fall short of truly capturing what the last two encapsulate: the obligation of loyalty or fidelity to a person, promise, engagement, etc. The observance of this obligation, fidelity to one's promise, oath, allegiance. The key concepts that give faith its proper definition for this application of the word is loyalty and observance. Combined, it is understood that an individual's loyalty is what prompts them to observe, to do the necessary required actions that the object of such loyalty might require. To enhance this understanding with specific regards to biblical texts requires us to dig into the original language used by those who penned it. A journey through the passages of the Old Testament yield only an astonishingly small handful of results. All of these indicate of the word faith in one form or another share a common root which they do not stray far from in meaning. The root from which these are derived is amen, which means build up or support. Thus, the concept presented throughout is that the righteous, good, pure, just individual is supported, built up, established, secured by God. In contrast, the wicked, unjust, the impure suffer the opposite and are not supported and built up. This leads to an understanding that, strictly speaking, textually, the concept of faith as we know it and understand it today does not exist in the writings of the Old Testament passages. However, one only needs to read Hebrews chapter 11 to know that conceptually it did exist. Not only did it exist, but was not different in concept than what is found in the New Testament. Passages, as the writer of Hebrews uses numerous individuals from the Old as examples of those living by the New. Turning our attention now to a journey through the New Testament passages, we again find a small offering of words in the original Greek language of the text that make it into English as faith, in one form or another. The overwhelming majority of the few hundred occurrences is the Greek word pitsa. The most vital of the other occurrences combines pisto with olgos or puna. Two basically form the negative form of pista. It literally translates to the English language. Pitsta would be most accurately represented by the word persuasion. So when speaking in terms of faith, the question should always be a matter of how persuaded are you with regards to what you have come to know. How persuaded are you? Are you persuaded in regards to the things in which God has spoken and which the things in God has said? Some people's faith vary from one extreme to another in their persuasion. As we also noted in what we talked about, it also has that root of loyalty. Are you loyal to the things that you've been persuaded of? Hey, I'm persuaded that this individual is a really good friend of mine, but am I loyal to that friendship? Is it reflected in our interactions? Is it reflected in how I support them and defend them when they're not even present? So when it comes to our faith, one of the things that we have to note initially is that our faith is something that can be measured. Anything that can be exercised, trained, practiced, gained, or lost can be measured. An individual's faith, how persuaded they are concerning their conviction, how loyal they are, can thus be measured. The fact that faith is measurable has been clearly supported by Jesus and his disciples through their words preserved in the scriptures of the New Testament. Following is a sampling of passages that help us understand the elasticity of how persuaded, how loyal any given individual might be, how faithful they are. During a return trip to the town Jesus spent the majority of his childhood and young adulthood while clothed in the flesh, Mark records in chapter 6 and in verse 6 of his gospel account that Jesus was marveled because of the lack of faith displayed by the residents. Thus we learn that it is possible for an individual to lack faith, meaning they are not in the slightest bit persuaded. They are in no way loyal. On the measuring stick, they have none whatsoever. In his second letter to the Christians in Thessalonica, the Apostle Paul makes a comment in the second verse of the 3rd chapter, reflecting that not everyone has faith. In other words, everyone has not been persuaded. This is something that we still observe in the world around us today. Not everybody believes. Not everybody has been persuaded by the gospel message. Not everybody is loyal to God and to Christ and to his church. In the midst of a lecture given by Jesus regarding not being overwhelmed by concerns with the worries of the material world, Matthew records in chapter 6 and verse 30 of his gospel account, Jesus commenting to the audience that they had little faith. Jesus' observance points to the fact that individuals can be in possession of a little amount of faith on the measuring scale. This would be like saying that these individuals were somewhat persuaded. In chapter 9 and verse 24 of Mark's gospel account, Mark makes note in his account of a man who recognized that he had some faith. Most English translations use believe here, but the Greek word is that word faith, but it is the same origin as faith. It all goes back to variations of that Greek word, but had need for more faith. So he recognizes there's an individual that had some faith, some belief, but he needed more. Not only did he know and desire more, but knew he needed help to get it. In essence, it would be like saying, "You have persuaded me a little bit. Go on and add to what you have said and done in order to persuade me more." We've probably been in conversations with individuals on any given topic where we're sharing ideals, sharing thoughts, and we have a difference of opinion, and they may say that, "Well, you're starting to persuade me. I'm becoming persuaded. Hey, given a little bit more time, you might win me over." So this is where this individual is, and we see in that measuring scale that there's faith there, but it needs to grow. It needs to increase. If you take a quick glance at what Matthew records in chapter 8 of verse 10 of his gospel account, when he is talking of the life of Jesus, he reveals that Jesus is making a comment concerning an individual that was in possession of great faith. Thus, this individual had been strongly persuaded concerning the things professed concerning Jesus. Therefore, it is possible to tip the scales in the opposite direction and to have a great amount of faith as opposed to just a little. And so we see two extremes in these accountings of faith. Little faith, great faith. Hopefully, we're leaning to the great side of that scale, but if not, we can improve. It's something we have to exercise. In a similar fashion, it's observed in verse 5 of Acts chapter 6 that Stephen was a man full of faith. A search through any dictionary will reveal that the term full clearly means that there is no room for anything else to occupy the space. It is holding all it can possibly hold. Stephen's faith measured to the brim. He was full of faith. There was no room for any doubt or anything else in him because he was full of faith. He was fully 100% persuaded, thus he was fully 100% loyal to the things which Christ and God would desire of him. From the case of Stephen, we can learn that it is possible for an individual to be fully persuaded, leaving no room for any doubt concerning that persuasion. The following chapter in Acts is a testament to the fact that Stephen stayed true to what he had been fully persuaded of, even during the violent end of his life. He defended Jesus to the end, and his defense of the things in which he was persuaded cost him his life by stoning. While it is plain to see from the passages examined above that individuals can possess faith in varying amounts, there remain some other conditions regarding faith that should also be explored. I feel it would be best to save the most positive factor concerning one's level of faith or strength of persuasion for last. We're going to get to that down the road. Thus, I will highlight the 5 conditions of faith that one should avoid at all costs. In Paul's first letter to young Timothy, 1 Timothy, he points out in the 19th verse of the first chapter that an individual's faith can become shipwrecked. He even goes on in the following verse to point out 2 individuals who had arrived at such a state. What is scary about this revelation regarding the state that one's faith can come to be in is the fact that a ship cannot wreck until after it sets out into the water, as is in the case of the 2 individuals mentioned by Paul. Thus, someone at any level of persuasion regarding what they have been through and exposed to, no matter how loyal they might currently be, they can become wrecked. Note that while some level of fault could lay in the hands of the individual becoming shipwrecked, shipwrecks are often the product of environmental factors. Others seeking to cause a wreck and or poor navigation by the one piloting the ship. Don't wreck your own ship. Don't despair entirely, though. Something wrecked can be rebuilt. Many times we become wrecked because of the hardships of life. Our faith is strong. We're persuaded. We're loyal. But then family members pass away. Then hardship comes from finances. Any number of things, an illness besets us. Any number of things can hit us and tear our life up that can cause us to become shipwrecked in regards to our faith. Stay in the water. Continue to pilot the course. We see that in Job. Job had everything taken from him, everything thrown at him, but he did not become utterly and totally shipwrecked and abandon his faith in God. He stayed persuaded that God was God and that God was in control. He stayed loyal and would not curse God. He might have cursed his own existence, but he would not curse God. And if you are shipwrecked, I've seen ships rebuilt. I was in the Navy 7 years, and there was ships that would get hit, that would have all kinds of things happen to them, that would be half sunk, and they bring them in the dry dock, and they refurbish them. Even when you're shipwrecked, you can be refurbished. Paul also expressed later in the same letter to Timothy, in the first verse of the 4th chapter, that it is possible for an individual to abandon the faith. And in fact, that same would be so later on. This is most likely the result of the measure of an individual's persuasion being weak, and thus once faced with opposing arguments or difficult times, will simply give up what they once were persuaded concerning. They were persuaded, they were loyal, but then they just abandoned it. They quit. And we probably all have met individuals who were once Christians at some level of strength, but then they abandoned it. They were pulled into the world and they left the faith. In similar fashion, in the 10th verse of the 6th chapter of 1 Timothy, Paul points out that some also wander from the faith. The particular cause of the wandering is the lure of money in the case that Paul writes about. Thus, one becomes more persuaded that money is the answer to their problems rather than obedience to God. In both of these two, it fundamentally falls on the individual who decides to give up, to give in, and to walk away. We don't need to be the kind who walk away from God. There is nothing that the world has to offer that can replace what God can provide. And sometimes we put our hope and we put our trust in worldly things, and that's not where it needs to lie. And if it does it, it can lead us to wander from the faith, to possibly even abandon the faith, to look back and find that our faith is shipwrecked. The next one that Paul states is worse than being an infidel, one with no persuasion or faith. In the 8th verse of the 5th chapter of Timothy, 1 Timothy, Paul points to those who have denied the faith. The word used here in the original language would best be defined by the word contradict, which is a reflection of those who know what they have been persuaded is the right thing to do in a given situation, but deny what they know to be right and choose to do what is wrong. The specific situation presented by Paul in this particular text is an individual choosing not to take care of the needs of their family. Thus, these individuals claiming that they had been persuaded to be Christians and live by the principles spelled out in the Bible are living in contradiction to those principles due to the fact that they are not seeing to the needs of their family as the Bible commands. And so one's faith could be on the measuring scale even worse than an infidel, as he states there in 1 Timothy chapter 5 in that chapter. And so we find that there can be those that even claiming Christianity, claiming to have faith, claiming to be persuaded of the gospel things, can in fact be living in total contradiction to them. And the sad thing is, many people looking at those living in contradiction, but claiming to be Christian and being of the persuasion of Christ, that pushes some people away from faith because you have these individuals. Now, none of us are perfect. We need to realize that those who are following after Christ are human, and we have our frailties and we have our failings, and we can't just base our relationship with God through Christ on someone else's relationship and what their relationship with God looks like, regardless of what they claim to be. Just because they're living in contradiction should not be a reason for us to turn away and abandon the faith, or to not even ever embrace it in the first place if we have never walked with God before. The final negative state which one can find their faith in is overthrown. The term used here is only found twice in the New Testament scriptures, both written by Paul. One to Timothy, that's found in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 18. and the other is in Paul's letter to Titus in the 10th and 11th verse of the first chapter. The direct translation of this word from the two root words that comprise it is to overthrow. Thus, the general concept is relatable to one party overthrowing the command or dominance of another. In both cases recorded in the passages mentioned above, it was an outside force that had come in and disturbed and disrupted others of the things they were persuaded about. From what Paul says concerning the individuals that are of the source of these incidences of individuals' faiths being overthrown, that they accomplished it by the use of lies, deception, and empty, meaningless words. Furthermore, he points to the fact that their very motivation for doing so is far from pure, but rather of their own personal gain. The moral here is to be sure that whatever you are persuaded about, whoever is trying to persuade you, make sure it is grounded in what is true and not a deceptive lie. In the next time that we come on the radio into the topic of making sure and how one can be sure. You see, all of these negative conditions an individual's faith can suffer behind us, it is time for a dose of positive. Regardless of the measure of one's faith, regardless of its current condition, regardless of whether it is doing great or it's suffering terribly, it can grow. When writing his second letter to the Christians living in Thessalonica, Paul writes in the 3rd verse of the 1st chapter very encouraging words reflecting the current state of their faith. Here he tells them that his observation is that their faith was growing with exceeding measure. This is an amazing statement considering the events recorded in the 17th chapter of the book of Acts by Luke related to Paul's experience in Thessalonica. Luke makes an observation in the 11th verse of this chapter reflecting on the reason why those in Berea were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica. It all centers on the nature by which they received and reflected on the things being taught them, how they were persuaded. It can be a great relief knowing that regardless of how skewed off course your persuasion regarding any topic is, that it can get back on course. More importantly, that no matter how you have deviated from the way of God, it's never too late while you're drawing breath to get back on course, to go back to the things persuaded you by the Holy Scriptures. Not only can you get back on course, but be propelled down the road as your faith grows and exceeds. How much more refreshing when it is in regards to the weightier matters of our own salvation, the eternal matters. In Hebrews, the writer there points out in the 6th verse of the 11th chapter that without being convicted with regards to the proper persuasion, it is impossible to fully accessible in God's sight, to be acceptable in God's sight. Conviction alone is not enough. An individual can be fully convicted regarding something that is not true. An individual must be diligent, seeking what is true, and then be persuaded by it, convicted of it. Next Sunday, we will continue our examination of faith, but I hope that the things regarding the eternal salvation of God's Word that you are persuaded of are true things and have come from a true source. It is on our individual shoulders to ensure that the path that we're on, the path that we're persuaded to follow, is the path that is truly a path of loyalty to God above and to His Son. I look forward to continuing this conversation and this deep dive with you next Sunday on Cogitations.
Tune in next Sunday at 9 for another edition of Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.